Welcome to our interview series on brave feminine leadership. I'm thrilled today to have Michelle Winzer join the conversation. Lovely to have you here, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. It's great to be here.
Pleasure. So in this series, our tagline is "More Secrets. Extraordinary leaders share their journey from good to great." And before we jump into that conversation, I'm just going to touch briefly on your bio, Michelle, so people understand your background. So, Michelle, after 30 years in banking, Michelle's joined the RACQ as the Group Executive Banking, and that was in December 2020, to lead RACQ's bank. Michelle was previously the Chief Executive at Bank of Melbourne and has held executive roles in retail banking, business banking, call centres and operations at Bankwest, the Commonwealth Bank and Westpac. Michelle holds a Master of Business Administration from Melbourne Business School and is also a graduate of the AICD Company Directors course and a fellow with Winzer. Michelle's passionate about leadership, digital transformation, service excellence and diversity and inclusion, and is a strong supporter of women in business and leadership. Michelle dedicates her spare time to supporting others by volunteering with organisations that help the homeless and is passionate about making a difference in the local community. As I said, Michelle, wonderful to have you here. For people in our audience who haven't had the pleasure of coming across you before, could I ask you to share with us a little bit about who you are as a human being and a bit about your journey?
Sure, Melissa. Thank you so much. And thank you for that lovely introduction. So I think a good way to describe me is that I'm a country girl who broke out of the stereotypical model of being the traditional thing that we are expected to be and actually moved to the big city. And, that was pretty significant when I was growing up. I think that, I am a hard worker. I am curious. I am courageous. And I have done things that, over the last 30 odd years that have really pushed me out of my comfort zone. And one of the things that I often think about is nothing's been handed to me on a silver platter. In fact, there's been lots of things thrown at me that you would say in the very difficult basket. So it's, I think that, that's pretty much me. And I've just worked really hard to try and achieve the things that I wanted to achieve.
Fantastic. So let's go right back then. So traditional farming family. What were the expectations for your future when you were growing up?
It was really interesting. I had a lovely upbringing on the farm, a very outdoor life and very active life. But in terms of career, there were no expectations. In terms of education, there were no expectations. So it was very much, very traditional farming family where, the expectation for me was that I would be a wife and a mother. And I say to people, they are two of the most favorite things in my life.
Yes.
But there was a lot more to me that I could actually do. So it was really interesting to start with that and to think about breaking out of that sort of cycle. And actually, I was very early on in my life and my career, I was very much about proving I could do it because nobody believed I could do it and nobody supported me in doing it. And so it was all about proving it, and I had to be the best at everything, and more to prove it to myself rather than anybody else. So it was a very, very interesting start, and I definitely didn't follow the path that was expected of me.
Can I ask you, when you talk about that, needing to kind of prove to yourself, what did that look like? How did you show up with that kind of mindset?
Yeah, so it was, I worked like a Trojan. I just worked so hard to do everything to the absolute best. I thought that I was only successful when I was the best at what I was doing. And it was really interesting. And that meant that I put an awful lot of pressure on myself, and I pushed myself really hard to do lots of things. And I just, and I didn't ever think that was impacting on others, because it was just the expectations I had of myself that I just needed to keep on pushing through. So, there's a lot of learnings over the years that's not exactly the best model, and you can't continue to do that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So we'll get into that in terms of the can't continue. But how did your career get started then?
Yeah, so I have to say, I was incredibly fortunate. So, I was in all of these different roles in banking and worked really hard and doing all of these roles. And then I worked with someone and truly was the turning point of my career. He was someone who saw something in me that I didn't know that I had, and pushed me to go for things that I never thought I could do.
Mm.
That was absolutely, I would call it the turning point in my career. He put a job in front of me that I never ever, on paper, there was no way in a million years that I would have been suitable for this role, but he then supported me, he pushed me, he coached me, and then he helped me to actually be successful at it. And that truly was the turning point, because I didn't see that I could do those things. I didn't have that belief. And it wasn't until somebody actually really committed their personal time and energy to me that helped me to think, well, actually, maybe there are some things that I could do. So it was a really interesting turning point of my career. And I, that I would say that was the start. Despite having 10, 15 years of work before that, that was really the start of pushing forward. And that person is still significant in my life and still pushes me and helps me today when you face those challenges that you inevitably face in business.
What an extraordinary gift to have found someone. And I would also suggest probably an extraordinary gift for the person who sponsored and mentored you, the relationship that you've developed.
You are absolutely right, Melissa, and it's so true. It is absolutely a gift. I feel so fortunate to have had someone who cared enough about me to want to invest in me and to support me in that way. He tells me often that it's a gift for him to have had that opportunity to actually do that, and he gets so much pleasure out of actually doing that himself. And and it's just created for me. I have a very strong focus on paying it forward and helping others and making a difference to the lives of those around me, because I know the benefit of that I have certainly achieved in having somebody do that for me.
Fantastic. So, and it just makes me think of, you often hear a conversation around female executives and the lack of female executives moving through, that females are over mentored and under sponsored. Was this someone who, in the early days, could they sponsor you? Like, were they the person in the room putting your name forward for things?
No, they were more a mentor for me.
Okay.
Absolutely, there was a difference. They were a mentor. They weren't the sponsor.
Okay.
And that was, it was really interesting over the years to learn the significant difference that, benefit that you can have on people in those two key roles. And I agree with you, Melissa. I don't think that we do sponsorship enough in business. I think that there is an opportunity for us to do a lot more in business around sponsorship. But yeah, it was definitely a mentor relationship as opposed to a sponsorship.
Okay, so this is your first really big role then that you didn't necessarily think you were up for, and got that support to apply for it. When you got into the role, did you have feelings of self-doubt about it? Did you experience what people talk about, imposter syndrome? I just saw the eye roll there, so that would be a yes.
Oh, so every day, Melissa, I absolutely, I honestly felt, what am I doing here? I honestly felt like surely they've made the wrong decision. Am I right to be here? It was so interesting, so fascinating. It was something I had to fight against all of the time. Unfortunately, it was, and that I think that it's fair to say that self-doubt and imposter syndrome is not something that goes away. It's that little thing on my shoulder all of the time. And even coming into talking to you today, I listened to some of the amazing women that you have interviewed before, and I sit there and go, oh, wow, I'm nothing like them. I got no value to add. So it's a constant challenge that I think I certainly have to fight against, and I have to be really, really strong in pushing against what it tries to do to you, and, you know, very deliberate, I would say, around actually addressing it.
Now, I love that you've been so vulnerable in sharing that. And it's one of the reasons I started the conversations, because there'll be people watching this and they'll be saying, Michelle's been the CEO of Bank of Melbourne. Yep. And she's worried about turning up and having a conversation around brave feminine leadership. So how do you stop that little voice that chirps up for all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. I think so. Over the years, I worked on quite a good approach, I think, to addressing it in myself. So, you know, I talked a lot about being a perfectionist and wanting to be the best at everything before, and you simply can't do that, and that is not a good model. And I learned that over the years, that has a significant impact on others, and it sends a very strong message to others that they are never good enough. And so I've had to really work on that over the years and realize that it's about being the best that we can be, but not being the best at everything. And you know, be presenting and contributing in the best way you possibly can, but not necessarily needing to be the expert at everything, to be the best at everything you do. And so I had to really push myself to work on, you know, a bit of an approach to deal with it. And I had a good reflection approach at the end of each day. And I would, you know, usually had a fairly decent drive home from work in the days that, you know, we were in the office. And you know, did a bit of a review of the day, but not in a review in a way to tell myself I wasn't good enough. A review in a way, did I approach that in the best possible way that I could? And if I'm presented with that situation again, is there something I would do differently? So to learn from that situation and to actually approach that in a slightly different way. So that was, you know, a bit of a process that I worked through over the years to think about the best possible approach. In terms of the self-doubt, you know, I often look at it, you know, there's a little person who sits on my shoulder here who tries desperately to make me think I'm not good enough and that I am not able to actually I shouldn't be there and I don't have the right to be there. And you know, there's a little bit of a self-dialogue that you have that says a couple of things that, you know, says that you are good enough. You absolutely have the right to be there. You know, just a few things that I say to myself when I feel that person coming back and trying to pull me back down. And, you know, and I think just being really comfortable to pause and to be your whole self is so very important in all of that. And I am, you know, as we've seen in this conversation, I'm very comfortable being vulnerable. I'm very comfortable, very authentic in what I do. So I'm not presenting as a person that I need to remember who I am. I'm just being myself.
Okay, so let's go to the heart of it and then to the heart of your experiences. Do you think leaders are born or made, Michelle?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And, you know, I think my perspective has actually changed over the years, Melissa. I personally think that leaders are born. But I think that, like any skill, if you don't work on it, you will lose that skill. And if you don't invest in that, you will lose that strength and you will lose that capability. And, you know, and I think, to be fair, I don't think I ever thought that. I always thought that it was something that it was, you know, leaders are made. But when I, you know, being a mother of, you know, 3 adult sons, that, you know, I actually have seen over the years things that they do that really truly demonstrate leadership strength. And then I reflected on myself, and I can see that if you don't continue to invest in your leadership capability, you will absolutely lose that. It's like a muscle. You know, if you don't go to the gym and if you don't work on your muscles, you'll lose your muscles. And I firmly believe that leadership is like that. And I firmly believe that if you ever think that you've nailed it, that you've absolutely done it, you know, you are the best leader that can possibly be, you need to go back and look in the mirror and actually think again, because I just don't think we ever we are ever there. I think there's always something we can learn. There's always something that you need to grow in and actually do better and different.
So you got two moments that really stand out for you as pivotal moments in your career where you really had to work that leadership muscle.
I have got so many moments where I had to work that lead.
What will you choose?
What will I choose? Two moments. Okay, so I think that the first moment is probably, I would call it the very first moment where I took on that role, where I just did not think I had the right to be there. And so I had to do a whole lot of work on that. What I would say was my early leadership development. And that was the point where I was really working out who I was as a leader and who I wanted to be, and why leadership was important to me and what value I could add. So that was a really pivotal moment early on in my career. And then I think that the second biggest pivotal or most pivotal moment for me was moving into Bank of Melbourne, where I was in the chief executive role, and it was a much bigger business than what I had led previously, and it was a whole business with full business bank, private bank, full business across the business there, and I think leading across that full spectrum, it really drove home that you need to have the right people around you to lead that business in the best possible way. It's not, you can't be an expert at everything, and you've just got to try and draw out the right questions and really, help people to achieve the best outcome in every situation. So your questioning is so critical in that.
So have there been points along the way where, you've had to sort of find your voice in certain situations?
Unfortunately, there's been lots of those, and I think I'm really lots of situations, Melissa, and I'm a very values-based leader. I am a person who has a very strong view about fairness and equity, about treating people the right way, doing the right thing, and making sure that we are respectful in every situation. And, I've had a long time in business, and there were several situations over the years where either people were doing the wrong thing or people were treating people the wrong way. And I couldn't ignore that. And I work firmly on the theory that, the behavior you walk past is the behavior you accept. And I just couldn't accept it. And, the first time I really spoke up about something that was just not happening in the right way, I would say it was the most difficult thing that I've ever done. But again, another theory that I have is you've got to be the change you want to see. I can't walk past that and then, say something to somebody else about it. If I'm not prepared to stand up against it, then I have no right to actually speak about it separately. And so I really pushed myself very much out of my comfort zone, and raised lots of things where people either weren't being treated right or people were doing the wrong thing. And it's been something, I would say, in the last 10 years that I've really had a strong voice. And, and like I said, every one of those situations has been very, very challenging. Probably the most challenging things I've faced in my career, but it was very much the right thing to do. And it's incredible the impact when you do that, the impact that has on others. And, when people actually see somebody standing up when something's not right, that is something that it really changes it. And I've had so many people come and talk to me after I've done those things, because they've seen these things happening for a long time, and they've just considered it totally unacceptable. So never easy, but absolutely right.
And we won't go into specifics of these, obviously, but we're talking about things like fraud and bullying, right? So serious issues that you've had to kind of step up and use your voice against. Okay, so is there a soft skill you think you're still developing at this stage of your leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that the soft skill is the networking. You know, I love to go to networking. I love to meet lots of different people, but I always feel uncomfortable, and I have to give myself a really good talking to before I get there about how I'm going to go into that situation. And that is something that I definitely have to still work on. I would say it's what I love to do though, and again, very much a very inclusive person. If I ever walk into an event and I see somebody, and I've been at client events where I see somebody standing alone, I will go and talk to them. I find, I never want someone to feel alone. I never want someone to feel like they're on the outer or they're not included in the situation. So that's the approach that I take, and really make sure that I go and make sure that they feel part of it and that they feel included and know somebody.
Now, I wanted to ask you, you will not be on your own, by the way, with networking. So I think it helps to know that lots of people are uncomfortable, and the more comfortable you can make others feel, the easier it becomes. So there was a point in your career where you were already in senior executive roles and you made the decision to go and pursue an MBA. What was behind that?
Yeah, thank you. Look, it was a big decision for me. So I had 3 teenage sons at the time. It was something I'd always wanted to do. I was fortunate that the person I was working for at the time encouraged me to do this, and identified that this was going to be something that would be very valuable in the rest of my career. As I continued to progress into senior roles, she identified that this was something that would be really valuable, and she supported me with that. So I'm grateful to her for identifying that. It was something I wanted to do, but, again, the courage to actually go back into adult learning, at that stage of your life was very overwhelming, I have to say. So I graduated from my MBA in 2017. I did it through Melbourne Business School, and we did the senior executive MBA program. It was the best program and the best way to do it. It was an insane couple of years. It was an intensive program. But it was amazing, and I have used so much from that learning as I've progressed my career, and I am so grateful that I did that. But it was so interesting. My youngest son was going into year 10, and I really felt like there was a window there before he was in year 12 where I could actually be a bit selfish and actually do something for myself, which was not something I was very good at and not something that I ever did, I have to say. But it was kind of a window, and it was amazing. I had my boys actually tutoring me and coaching me on some of the topics and helping me, which was wonderful. It was just fantastic. But it was very, very hard, that decision to go in there, and the self-doubt that you faced, essentially, especially walking to a room of 45 very, very experienced and very high achieving senior executives. The self-doubt was off the Richter scale for that when you first walked in. But again, I'm so grateful to have done it. I'm so grateful to have achieved it. I have met so many amazing people through it who continue to be great friends and colleagues as we work through things. And it's definitely something I recommend, but I really recommend it later in life. I think having 20 years of business experience under my belt before I did it was so valuable to to move into that next stage of your career. And that was something that I definitely would recommend people do.
And I guess you've got some tremendous real life experience to really reflect on in terms of where it could have been useful and practical. It's really interesting listening, Michelle, to, and I know a lot of our listeners will feel exactly the same way, but to hear you talk about it was a difficult decision to do something, but you thought you could finally be a little bit selfish.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to reflect on, why do we think it is selfish to go and do something like that?
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I definitely, something that I have found is you spend your life thinking about others. You spend your life, whether it's your family, whether it's your children, whether it's your, the team that you are leading, you're always thinking about other people. And, to take that time to really invest in yourself, it really, I did at the time feel like it was selfish, but it was such, and I think it's definitely not the right thing to think. There's no doubt, Melissa, and you're absolutely right in your line of questioning, because investing in yourself is actually the best thing you can do. And continually investing in yourself will make you a better leader, will make you a better employee, will certainly, make you I think, make you a better mother, make you a better wife, make you a better partner, whatever it is. Yep. There's no doubt that all of the things that you achieve through that investment are definitely applicable to everything in life. So it certainly shouldn't be selfish, but I think we should absolutely see it as an investment.
Yeah. And, it's not a criticism, it's just a fact, isn't it? That so many of us feel that way when we try and carve out time for ourselves, that, what's going to give, what's going to suffer. You talked about being a perfectionist, and I loved how self-aware you were about the fact that did impact on others around you who felt like they weren't necessarily good enough, as I guess you were pushing to get the best results. What did you have to, in the sort of whole scope of your life, not just career, but in terms of working out being a perfectionist wasn't necessarily serving, what did you have to let go of? How did you let go?
Very, very hard. And look, I had help identifying that was not the best approach. There's no doubt. And I was grateful for people to help me to identify that there are different ways that you can approach things, and understanding the impact that you can actually have on others. Yeah. So I think that it's about actually, when you're as a leader, I think the best thing that you can do is actually try and draw out the great people around you. And I've certainly approached leadership with the mastermind theory. Have the best people around you. I'm not the expert at everything, but let me draw out the best experience and knowledge and capability from all of those people that I get the great pleasure to work with in a team. So, and I think that's the significant difference for me from being a perfectionist, where you think you know everything and you think that you are the person who has all of the answers. Well, I had to very, very strongly accept that I didn't have all the answers, and I need to draw that from other people. And I have the capability to learn. And I think that there were several points in my career, and probably that pivotal point first off as well, where I moved from different parts of the business that I actually knew nothing about. Yes. And that was fantastic, because it puts you into that absolutely out of your comfort zone, where I needed to ask great questions. I needed to ask open questions, I didn't necessarily have the answer. I needed to actually draw that out from other people. So putting myself in lots of roles over the years where I actually don't know and I'm learning, and there's lots of things that I need to draw from other people. So it's a bit of that. I think the self-talk is a really critical point for me, and thinking about what sort of questions am I asking people, and how am I impacting others, and how am I acknowledging everyone else's contribution as well, so that it, because and I'm very big on that recognition of people's contribution.
I even, just to throw something in from my perspective, I remember when I was CEO, and my partner and I swapped roles for a while. So he came home with the kids. We were lucky to be able to do that. Yeah. And my own perfectionist tendencies turned up in, how the house had to look and things like that. Yeah. And, I just remember one day just thinking to myself, just be grateful that you're not having to do this stuff. Like, it's done differently. So what? Move on. But it does, that whole perfectionist control thing is interesting. I'm not a psychologist, and neither are you, so we'll leave it to someone else to analyse.
You're absolutely right, Melissa, and I think my learning of that is, it's about accepting, because I was exactly the same. I was working a lot, I was away a lot, I was traveling a lot. And, if I came home and, one of the big learnings for me was if I came home and things weren't done to the standard that I thought that they should have been done, then if I'm not prepared to go and do it myself, then I need to just, accept that it's done and it's fine and everyone's okay and everyone's happy and healthy. And, my husband and I had to go through, a whole learning program there, just like you, by the sound of it. And, and that was fascinating to work through. But I, really got to challenge our perspectives on that.
I like what you said about needing to pull on, a mastermind of people around you. One of the things I think is, how people say it takes a village to raise children. Yep. I think it takes a village to raise a leader, and it takes a village to support a CEO. Yep. So, I just wonder, in your time as CEO, what did that village look like?
Yeah, it takes a village, and I totally agree with you. And I think that we come across people in our career who are so special to us and who make such a difference to us individually. And you've got to have those people who really challenge you, who really are very prepared to be honest with you, very prepared to say to you, this is actually a different way to approach that. Maybe you should think about this. You've got to have those people around you, and you don't want a team of yes people around you who just say you're amazing and you've got nothing to work on. You actually need those people who are going to say to you, well, actually, let's just talk about that situation. Did we approach that in the best possible way? Yeah. So over the years, there's no doubt I have got a whole range of very special people, from men to women to everyone, who have been absolutely critical to me. And one of the things that I've been really prepared to do is ask for that feedback and listen and accept that feedback and have a very strong focus on learning and growing, because that for me is that's when you are, when you're feeling uncomfortable is when you're truly growing. And that's what I think you've got to be prepared to do.
Did you have strong female role models along the way?
I certainly did. So earlier on in my career, it was probably more the male role models, there's no doubt. There's definitely some significant women in my life in probably the last 15 years who have been very significant and great supporters for me. Now I have this wonderful balance, of people in that network that I absolutely feel comfortable to call on.
Brilliant. Did you ever run up against any of the sort of so-called double binds that women face along their career, in terms of, too soft, too hard, never just right, or bossy versus assertive?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. D, all of the above. So, I think that, earlier in my career, before I worked on my perfectionistic tendencies, I was probably too assertive, and I was probably, I felt like I was being brave by saying the things that were on everyone's minds. And then I worked out, well, there's actually a different way you could say that to achieve a better outcome. And so I worked through all of that over the years. But one of the things, I'm really, what you see is what you get. There's nothing hidden with me. I am very genuine, very authentic, very real, very down to earth. Don't believe in hierarchy. I'm absolutely, I'm in the trenches working with everybody. I think that if I'm not prepared to do something, then I shouldn't ask my people to do it. And, so I'm very real and genuine and very comfortable with that. Feel like you should never be concerned about, who are you coming to talk to today? You should always know that the way that I'm communicating with you will always be the same as any time. So, over the years, being, caring about people, being genuine, being feminine, being, probably soft, people definitely had that question. Do you have the actual capability to do the tough things? So, but I think, and what was really important to me over the years was to be truly be who I wanted to be, and to be the person that I really am, so that nobody had any questions about who they were going to approach. So there's no doubt I felt like in many situations I was Robinson Crusoe. I was the only person who was like that. But as I've continued to learn and grow over the years, I think that's just, I've continued to develop in ways that I know that I can make a greater impact and help others.
Michelle, why do you think, I'm still puzzled. It's the reason I started all of this in terms of all these conversations and questions. We're just not seeing the cut through of females getting into those top executive roles and top CEO roles. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think my personal view, and I have, because of all of the different things that I've faced, we create environments sometimes in business that I just don't think are very conducive to everyone. There is no doubt that, certainly, and I only speak from my experience, that, women sometimes feel a greater sense of responsibility in different situations and things that they have to do. And we have to create environments in business that support women to continue to achieve their potential, but to achieve all that they want to achieve.
Yeah.
There's we still do have children. We still have babies, right? That is a fact that we will never change. And we need to support women through that and make sure that we create the environments that help them to come back and to continue to achieve their potential as they're still doing, having children, if that's what they would like to do. And I just don't think that we think about those things all the time. It's the simple things like, the times that you have meetings, actually making sure women stay connected when they're on, paternity leave. There's all of the things that we do. I think we are still working on that. I am so grateful to work with some of the most amazing young women in my business here, and feel so fortunate to have the opportunity to bring those women through and to actually support them. And, we've just got to be really, really conscious of this into the future to make sure that we actually sponsor these women and that we support them and that we help them to achieve their potential in whatever path they choose to progress through.
Now, I know you and I share a similar experience in terms of volunteering at one stage to sell the big issue with one of the vendors. What did you take away from that experience?
Yeah, it was the most humbling experience that I've been part of. My family and I have spent several Christmases serving food for the homeless, and we do that because we're fortunate and we wanted to give back and we wanted to help others and we wanted to make it a Christmas a special day for a lot of other people, and that was such a humbling experience. The big issue was fascinating. I have to say, it was absolutely fascinating. So I did it in Collins Street in Melbourne, and I was dressed with the big issue vest, and you're there whereas people are walking to work. People actually walked around to try and avoid you. They actually stepped away. They looked down. They don't look at you. And I was quite distressed actually by the end of it. And I was doing my absolute best to get them to actually come and look at me and come and talk to me and buy and understand I'm a human being and every person who's selling the big issue needs respect, and you should be really kind and gentle to them. And it was really fascinating the way people responded. And it was an eye-opener for me. But I've never, ever treated people with disrespect. And I was really blown away by how people really avoided you and stepped away and did everything in their power not to. And then there were other people who were just walking up and are so amazing, and they were buying, a whole lot of half a dozen versions to put in the office. And I just, it was really fascinating. And my takeaway was, don't ever treat anyone with disrespect, and really understand that there's a person there and they're just trying to do something to make a few dollars. And seriously, always, even if you can't buy that day, that's okay. Look them in the eye and say, good morning, good afternoon, how are you? No, thank you today, right? It's not that hard to be kind to people. And I think we need to do that a lot more.
So I wanted to ask the final question I ask of everybody, Michelle, which is, from your perspective, what does brave feminine leadership look like? And do you think it needs to change?
And good on you, Melissa, for the series that you do and the work you do with these interviews as well. I think it's amazing to hear from so many people. Brave Feminine Leadership for me is about being authentic and genuine. It's about being yourself. It's about being confident in your contribution. It's about standing up and being counted and knowing that your perspective is important and worth sharing. And, we need to make sure that, we support other people. I think that don't feel like, the important thing I think about brave feminine leadership is about not trying to be someone else. Don't think that you need to be this type of person or you need to be this person. You need to continue to learn and grow. All of us need to continue to learn and grow, but no, we don't want a cookie cutter approach where every woman looks like this or every man looks like this. We actually want people to be independent and individual, and we want them to bring their whole self and be comfortable bringing their whole self to work. I think we need to do a lot more in bringing women through and supporting women to actually achieve that potential and to be comfortable with that. And, sometimes these conversations are really powerful for that, because there's a lot of women who I work with who go, they just assume that, it was easy for you, or you never faced any of those challenges. And I think, as you said earlier, Melissa, it's about understanding that we all face those challenges. We face those challenges every day, and we got to help people to actually work through that, because you're going to face them, but how do we actually bring people through? So that would be the big thing for me.
Fantastic. Michelle, I'm so glad you joined our conversation. Thank you for being part of the Brave Feminine Leadership conversations.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of it.